Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist, Ben Gallagher. This is the second one in the digestion lessons, which is the second in the overall basic physiology playlist. This one focuses on the digestive system itself. So in the last video, Digestion 1, we looked at what digestion is and how it goes from breaking polymers into monomers and the different ways that that happens. Now we're going to look at where that happens. This is suitable for GCSE level, and please do subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you. So just so we know what we're talking about with the digestive system, let's do a really quick recap of the last video and talk about what digestion is and why it's important. So basically what we have is the polymers in other organisms, so their carbohydrates, their proteins, their lipids, their DNA. Those are the compounds that make them up, that are their storage molecules that define what they are. Now we want the building blocks from their polymers. That's essentially all that digestion is. We take their polymers, we smash it down into the monomer units again by either physical or chemical digestion. Now that allows us to use their monomers to build our own polymers. It's basically a good analogy to say if you've got a building block house, if we smash that building block house down to get the blocks back out, we can put them together in the pattern we want and we can make a rocket like the one above my head. Okay, digestion is just that first bit over there of breaking the building block house back into the building blocks so that we can absorb them, transport them around their body, absorb into our own cells so that we can rebuild them into our own polymers. So that's the why and how digestion happens. Let's now move on to the where it happens, which is the digestive system. So what we're going to do on this slide, we're going to look at a really big overview of the digestive system, because one of the key things that you'll get in exams, you'll get a picture of the digestive system and you'll be asked to label some of the different bits. That's what this is going to cover. They may also ask, what does that bit do? So we'll put that very briefly on this slide as well. There's then two main areas of the digestive system that you need to know in quite a lot more detail. We'll deal with those in next slides. This is just going to be an overview. If we're talking about the digestive system, it's basically one long muscular tube that goes from your mouth to your anus. All the way as you go down through, different things are happening. The tube may get a bit wider, it may get a bit shorter. Some bits are very long, some bits are very short, but it's still just one tube. In adults, it's around about 9 meters long. Now I've put a little scale next to me here. As we go through this diagram above me, I'm going to add sections to this so that you can get an idea of the relative lengths and widths of the different parts of this one tube. Okay, so we'll build all of it up. So let's start with the mouth. The mouth, we've talked about physical and chemical digestion in the last video. You've got both of those going on in the mouth. In the saliva, you have carbohydrase enzymes, specifically the amylase enzyme that breaks starch down into the glucose monomer. But you've also got chewing going on, which is the physical digestion to smash the food down, increase its surface area so that it can be attacked more easily by enzymes. From the mouth, you need to swallow the food. So it goes down your esophagus. The esophagus, food pipe, gullet, whatever you may have previously called it, the esophagus is its correct name. Now the American spelling of this doesn't have the O, it's just the ES, esophagus. Either is fine in the exam, it doesn't matter whether you include the O or not, but it's the esophagus. Now this is where we can start with my diagram next to me. I'm going to mark over there the esophagus as that first little section. So it's thin relative to the entire 9 meters. The esophagus doesn't take up much. Think it only goes from your mouth to your stomach, which is only here. You know, all of that pretty much fits on my screen there. We're talking about that sort of length. Okay, so it doesn't take up a lot on mine. But let's talk about the esophagus a bit more. Firstly, food doesn't just fall down your esophagus. It's not a hollow tube. It's actually pretty closely, tightly closed, more like that. Okay. To get food down there, muscles in the wall of the esophagus need to squeeze it down. Imagine if you had a tube of toothpaste, you took the cap off the bottom and you squeezed from the top. You could totally empty the entire tube by squeezing in sequence as you go down. That's what happens with your esophagus. And that process is called peristalsis. You can feel peristalsis happening. if you put your fingers just kind of to the side of your windpipe, your trachea, sort of slightly to the side and around the back, don't press hard or you will sort of push yourself, it'll be very uncomfortable. But if you swallow, you can feel a slight ripple go past your fingers. That's that wave of muscular movements. Now, peristalsis isn't only in the esophagus. Peristalsis is the squeezing motion that pushes your food right the way through that 9-meter tube. Okay, but it's an important keyword. Now, from there, the esophagus leads down to the stomach. Now, the stomach, we know from the previous video, is full of stomach acid to do chemical digestion. The protease enzyme, which remember is unusual as an enzyme because that enzyme, or the specific one in the stomach, likes an acidic pH. It will only fold into its correct shape and correctly form its active site. If you remember back to the enzyme videos, it will only form its correct shape in acid pH, and its shape will determine its function, will determine the shape of the active site and whether it's complementary to the substrate it breaks down. So it's an unusual form of protease. You've also got churning in the stomach because, like peristalsis, like that squeezing movement down, the stomach's very muscly, but it can just squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and mash the food up. So you've got that going on in the stomach as well. If we add the stomach to my chart here, you can see it's relatively short. Your stomach's only sort of 15 to 20 centimeters long. It can get bigger, it can expand. The bigger you are, the more you eat, the bigger your stomach tends to be. And notice it's much wider, but it's still just a continuation of the same tube. Now, when we come out of the stomach, we come into that first little loop called the duodenum, which leads to the small intestine. The duodenum is literally the bit that comes from the stomach down so that it can join to the main wiggly bit of your small intestine. Now, if we put the size of both of those on here, duodenum is there, small intestine, enormous. Okay, the small intestine is the greatest length within your entire digestive system. Of the 9 meters, it takes up around about 7 meters of it. But that's because it's in the small intestine that lots and lots and lots of the very fine digestion happens. Loads of the enzymes are working. But it's also where you absorb the nutrient monomers. So you need a big long distance to give you maximum amount of time to absorb the maximum amount of nutrition from your food. From the small intestine, we then go into the large intestine. Now, if you look again next to me when it comes up, the large intestine is wider. That's why it's called the large, but it's actually nowhere near as long. Okay, if you want a good analogy of it, your small intestine is about the same diameter as your thumb, your large intestine more like your wrist. Okay, so it is a lot larger in terms of width, but it's much, much shorter. But as I put up there, the main function of the large intestine is to absorb water. So when you get an infection in your large intestine, maybe food poisoning or something like that, and your large intestine isn't correctly removing the water it should, the water all comes out the other end as diarrhea. So you know if you've got diarrhea, your large intestine isn't absorbing the water that it should be. Okay, so the large intestine absorbs that. So all that should be left is the wastes that you can't absorb stuff from, that you don't absorb some of the water from. That gets stored in the rectum. The rectum is a muscular chamber at the end of your large intestine. It can expand depending on how much waste is in there. If I've marked it on next to me here, you can see it's relatively short. It can be wider than the large intestine depending on how full it is, but the anus is just the point that stores the waste or the feces before it finally gets passed out of the anus. So this has got basically the whole overview of the digestive system. There's two parts of this we really need to focus on. One are events that are going on in the duodenum, and one's what's happening in the small intestine. Because with the duodenum, it's the only part of this long tube where you've got some things being added on. Specifically, you've got the liver, which I've just marked up there. The liver makes bile, which we talked about in the last video. The gallbladder, just kind of underneath, which is where bile is stored. And a really, really important organ called the pancreas. So it's the pancreas that creates lots of the digestive enzymes. So to add those to this diagram next to me, you can see there I've got the liver, quite large, with the gallbladder in green just marked on top of it. And we've got the pancreas. But those, notice, are the only two things added on to the one long tube that's just coiled up inside your body. So take a screenshot of this one because it covers most of the basic information that you just need to memorize. Right, let's focus on that some more, the key events in the duodenum. This comes up in the exams a lot, but not only don't just learn it for the exams, this is a really important part of your whole digestive system. So if I just pull down that middle section from the diagram before, and we label the stomach, liver and gallbladder and the pancreas, but we're focusing on what's inside that yellow circle there, that region of the duodenum. Now you can see there the tube of the digestive system comes down from the esophagus, down through the stomach, then it loops out around the duodenum, disappears there behind the large intestine and would carry on down. But what we've got there, the food when it comes down to the stomach's full of acid to help chemically digest the food. It will also do churning for physical digestion, and you've got the protease enzymes working to digest the proteins and polypeptides to break them up, to break them into the amino acids. But then that food is going to leave the stomach to enter the duodenum. Now the liver, we've already said, creates bile, which is an alkaline. It stores it in the gallbladder until it's needed. Now this is when the system knows when it's needed by when food leaves the stomach. So I put a number 1 on there because that's kind of the one for the key events in the duodenum. Food leaves the stomach and enters the duodenum. At that point, bile will be secreted into the duodenum. You can see I've put a little green arrow there with a 2 on it. So event 2, the bile goes into the duodenum. Now think, we've said bile is an alkaline. The stomach was full of acid. So the first thing that's going to happen is that bile is going to neutralize the stomach acid, creating a neutral pH. Most enzymes want a neutral pH, so that's really good. Plus, we don't really want an acid, a strong acid at that, going through the small intestine creating damage. So that's really important that step 2, that bile comes in. But of course, bile does the other thing that we talked about in video 1, it emulsifies the fats. That breaks the lumps of fat down into much smaller droplets. That dramatically increases their surface area so that enzymes can attack them more quickly. Moving on to the pancreas then, the pancreas can now add large quantities of digestive enzymes. So you'll see I've put the 3rd arrow there in blue. I've written a number 3 on it. It's the 3rd event. Okay, those digestive enzymes can now pile into the duodenum, having all the stomach contents being already been neutralized, and the surface area has been increased by the bile. So what that means is that the carbohydrates, the proteases, the lipases, the nucleases that have come from the pancreas have now got an optimal pH, they can start working, they can start digesting those polymers. So from these 3 events, what we've achieved is an optimum temperature, because it's inside the body anyway, so the temperature should be optimum for the enzymes. We've now got an optimum pH because of the neutralization caused by the bile. And we've got a very large surface area, not just because of the emulsification of fats, but the churning in the stomach, the chewing in the mouth, it's all helped to break it down and increase the surface area. These 3 things together mean we can have very rapid digestion at the start of the small intestine. This comes up a lot in the exams. Sometimes it's just phrased as simply as explain the role of bile, but it might be a 5 or 6 mark question because you've got to incorporate all of the information that's on this slide. So this is a really important slide. Make sure you understand everything on this before you move on. So we've just created these optimal conditions for the enzymes as it all moves now into the small intestine. Now remember we said at the start, the purpose of the small intestine is to absorb all the nutrients, get them into your blood so they can be transported to your cells. So there's a lot of adaptations that the small intestine has. So look in the top corner up there where I've just put a section of the small intestine. And if I just mark in a circle there a little bit of the small intestine, and that's what we're going to expand. So on here, on this diagram, you'll see I've just drawn the tube running through, just a cross section through the tube. We've got an outer wall that I've put in dark red. We've got an inner wall that I've put in pink. And inside the tube, all those little green blobs are just representing the food molecules. Okay. Now I've drawn them quite large because they need to be big enough for you to see. But please remember those green blobs should be absolutely tiny because we're now talking about microscopic monomers. Okay, so we've got this tube. Now think about what's happening to those food particles. They're going to be being pushed along that tube by the peristaltic movements, because in the walls that I've drawn on here, there would be loads and loads of muscle. That muscle is squeezing the food along, squeezing it in turn to push it along there. Now, what we would hope is that a lot of that food, instead of just being pushed along, is being pushed to the walls, because of course it's through the walls that the monomers, that the nutrients can move and move into the blood system. So I'll add that to my diagram now. You've got loads of blood vessels going through the walls of the small intestine, because as those nutrients get to the walls, they can move through the walls of the small intestine by diffusion or active transport if it needs to go against the concentration gradient, and straight into the blood supply. Now, if you're looking at this picture, you ought to be thinking that that's not a very good mechanism, because what you've got there is a huge volume and not very much surface. If you look, you've only got the thin pink lines through which you can absorb. Huge amounts of that food's just going to be pushed on down there. So this isn't a very well adapted small intestine, but that's not what your small intestine looks like, because actually the walls are like this. The inner wall of the small intestine is massively folded. You look at my picture now, compared to the thin pink line that I had before as the inner lining, now with that wavy line, it's a huge amount more surface area. All of that surface through which the food molecules can move. If you're not sure why this would be such a big help, please go back to the transport through membranes videos, the diffusion ones and active transport, and especially and most importantly, because it's so relevant in digestion, the surface area to volume ratio video. That one is so important. Okay, so these give us a huge amount of surface area. And of course, you've got blood vessels going down into each one of those projections so that the blood is really close to the food inside the tube, so it can get more easily into there. Now, these projections are called villi, and inside your small intestines there are millions and millions and millions of these villi. Okay, just for completeness, you've also got another system of tubes that go through these. I've drawn them there in green. You can see them going down. These are called the lacteal. Now, you don't need to know much about the lacteal at all. You just need to know that they're there. Okay, so tubes that run down, they're only really there to transport fats, because you don't want too many of the lipids or the fatty acids or the glycerol traveling around in your blood. So a lot of them are carried around in the lacteal, which leads out into the lymphatic system, just to keep them out of your blood. But that lacteal is there. So you've actually now got a lot of adaptations going on, or certainly those three things that I've labelled. But it doesn't stop there. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to enlarge a little circle. If you look where that yellow circle has just appeared, I'm going to expand that out to here to really zoom in onto what cells are in the wall of the small intestine. And it's these ciliated epithelial cells that you've probably come across before. Look at each one of those cells. On the surface, sort of nearest to me on the side, you can see they've got loads of little finger projections. Now, when those are in the small intestine, as these ones are, those little projections are called microvilli. So we've got villi as the big foldings, these tiny foldings on the cells. So these foldings, remember, are made of membrane, the actual skin of the cell, the thing that the food nutrients need to move through. And those microvilli, given they're on every single cell that lines the surface, those greatly increase the surface area even further. They make it enormous. Plus, within these cells, we've got loads of these little structures, which I'm hoping you recognise from the cell biology lessons. Those are mitochondria. And the reason why all these cells have loads and loads of mitochondria is because mitochondria do respiration to get the energy for active transport. Remember, you can only absorb up to 50% by diffusion, because then you lose your concentration gradient. After that, you need to actively transport, pull them in, which requires energy. It also requires a protein in the cell membranes, because of course proteins do everything. So there's lots of information on this slide, and this is a really common thing in the exam. Explain how the small intestine is adapted to absorb nutrients. So take a screenshot of this one again, make sure you understand it before you move on. And that's it, that's the whole digestive system. So if you pair that information with what we did in the first video, you've got a very complete overview of digestion. Now what I'm going to do on this last slide, just to help you out and to try and get you used to answering properly in exams, I'm going to do a summary, but as a piece of extended writing. Now I'm not going to spend ages on this. I'm not going to read through it all. If you want to use it, please pause the video, have a good read through it yourself. All I'm going to show you is how easy it can be to convey vast amounts of information to get really, really high marks in a fairly minimal amount of writing. Okay, I'm going to reveal my answer to the question of explain the digestive system. Okay, now this might look like a lot of writing, but it really isn't. That's 269 words there. I did a word count on it. Okay, and what I really want you to appreciate is look how many of the words are in capital letters in blue. I've marked all of the key words, all the things that would be worth marks in the exams. I've marked them in blue, and look at it. Every single line of what I've written contains 2, 3, 4 key words. There's only 269 words to explain the entire digestive system. If your teacher said, write me an essay to explain the digestive system, they would be well within their allowance to say, I want 1,000 words or I want 2 pages. If you handed this minimal amount in, guaranteed your teacher would look at you and go, oh, that can't be enough. That's not good enough. You haven't written enough. And then they'd read it and go, wow, that's a lot of detail in a small amount of time. This is called concise scientific writing. It's packing the detail in without waffling and repeating and expounding on stuff that doesn't need it. So have a read of it if you want to. It summarizes everything from the last 2 videos. And please practice this kind of writing, getting detail into small amounts of space. So that's it for digestion, which is the first of the 3 major physiological systems that we're looking at. So from here, I want you to go on to the respiratory system 1 video, which is a system overview and looks at gas exchange. There's 2 on respiratory system, then there's the circulatory system ones, and that completes the physiology units within phase 1. As always, please do subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. If you find this video useful, give it a like, and head to my Facebook page as well if you want to find lots of other useful bits of biological information that aren't necessarily directly linked to your curriculum, but are very interesting anyway. Thank you.